Okay, thanks, Hong Nong. Thanks, President Wu. So it's, I think, a great occasion for all of us getting together. The time has never been more timely and illuminating because there's, I see some sort of very interesting debate on either side on how our relations will be heading on and what kind of things just laying out in coming months and the coming years. I think Ambassador Cui, with his great illumination, present us his great insight. I think it's an excellent, some sort of, let's say, push for intellectual contribution from our first panelists. So I don't want to spend any words introducing distinguished panelists, but I'm totally for sure, I think today's first session, I think will be a big addition to Ambassador Cui's pioneered some sort of such a new dynamic and a new momentum, even just in intellectual manner. So then let me give a floor to Michael Swaine, the first panelist. Then each of the panelists will have 12 and 15 minutes. I think the shorter the better because we have more time for Q&A. Please, Mike.
Great. Thank you very much, Su Feng. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the invitation and good opportunity to see old friends again. This panel is on U.S.-China strategic relations, so I guess I took it as sort of stepping back from the individual issues, and I interpret strategic relations not in the narrow sense here of nuclear relations, which often is the case, but really the overall political and power relationship between the U.S. and China as it affects Asia and global stability and prosperity. Before addressing the current situation under the Trump and Xi presidencies, I think it's important to define what I believe are the two key features of the larger strategic context that inevitably shapes the U.S.-China relationship regardless of who's leading the two countries. First, as Ambassador Cui mentioned, there is an ongoing need for the U.S. and China to cooperate in managing the tumultuous and unpredictable, somewhat unpredictable at least, course of the global economy, as well as a variety of transnational concerns and threats, such as WMD proliferation, terrorism, etc. I mean, these issues will continue to demand bilateral and multilateral support for an array of existing international regimes, albeit probably with some modification of rules and structures over time. But the basic regimes, I think, will continue and will continue to be supported by both the United States and China in dealing with these transnational threats, which are not going to go away. I think the leaders of both countries have long understood this deepening imperative to cooperate on these issues, and ignoring it, I think, will likely prove disastrous for both the two countries and for the global system. So that's one major factor that I think always influences the relationship. The other one is more of a challenge between the two countries, which is the critical need to effectively manage the power transition that is occurring both globally and especially in Asia, marked by the rise in economic and hence military power of the developing world led by China and to a lesser extent India, and the relative decline in power and influence of the developed world led by the US. Now, this phenomenon is occurring against a backdrop of growing economic and informational globalization, which is deepening interdependence among states while also provoking resistance and protectionism and various forms of what I would regard as chauvinistic nationalism. And this is occurring in various states to varying degrees. The result is a variety of potentially contradictory policies and approaches, and in some cases, demagogic appeals to publics to support policies which would undermine the overall growth of greater economic interaction and benefit. In economics in particular, we seem to be ending a phase of market liberalization and access as a key to U.S. trade policy and shifting to something that is much more conditional, transactional, and we need to avoid a race to the bottom in this sphere and avoid a kind of beggar thy neighbor strategy. This power transition and the globalization that accompanies it, in some respects, have yet to be recognized and or accepted by many observers. For example, many people in the United States seek to reverse it or to protect against it by arguing for me-first policies in trade and immigration and an improbable doubling down in defense spending to stay well ahead of China. Others, especially China, seek to more effectively use this transformation to strengthen their influence over critical issues, many of which are legitimizing issues for the Chinese government, such as sovereignty disputes, regional and trans-regional economic networks, and various global rules and norms. In this process, China is trying to reassure other countries, as Ambassador Cui has just done, that China will not use its growing power and influence to undermine the interests of other countries. However, I think we need more than words. We need much more specific actions. The dangers and contradictions of the power transition that we see today, along with the challenges of managing economic growth and transnational threats, are most clearly seen in the Western Pacific. This region, unlike any other, is both the primary driver of global growth and the locus of competition between the two most important global powers, China and the US. This competition is natural and inevitable, but it's made much more dangerous by the presence of deep-seated critical differences between the two countries over the handling of major sources of conflict. Korea, Taiwan, maritime disputes, we all know these. And by different views about what is the best distribution of power in the Western Pacific for preserving stability and prosperity. To manage this complex environment, both nations must strike a stable balance in policies and in power that facilitates continued mutual economic development while avoiding serious political military crises sparked by both miscalculation or excessive confidence on the one side and an overreaction on the other side. I think my own view is to make this situation more stable in the Pacific, we need to think about creating an effective balance of power, which has as a basis for it the creation of a de facto buffer of sorts between China's maritime periphery and the United States and US power in the region. This has to be based on a series of types of moves which I think are important for both sides to make, which I've written about. Now, within this context, let's turn to the current situation. What are Trump and Xi Jinping actually doing to address these basic structural problems and challenges, as well as opportunities, in the international system and in Asia? Well, in my view, so far, not much. There's a lot of positive remarks regarding their mutual willingness and intention to cooperate and work together to address common problems from Korea to trade. And there's some very, what I would regard as marginal economic agreements thus far. But neither leader has expressed a clear, consistent, pragmatic, and relatively specific strategic plan for dealing with the kinds of challenges I've just mentioned. Everything is approached piecemeal and from a relatively narrow perspective, or is glossed over with bromides and slogans. For President Trump, his positive personal view toward Xi Jinping, plus his apparent transactional approach to diplomacy, has created a generally positive atmosphere in the relationship, as Ambassador Cui mentioned. The recent diplomatic and security dialogue was generally positive, if not greatly productive. From my perspective, the dialogue's most significant accomplishment was a commitment to reduce friction in the defense relationship. I won't go into it for time reasons. However, on the negative side, I think President Trump has exhibited what's basically a schizophrenic approach toward China, and especially on the critical North Korea issue. He gyrates between bombastic categorical remarks about stopping North Korean nukes, putting pressure on Beijing, and showing patience, while suggesting severe actions are planned. But Matterson and Tillerson, his cabinet associates in this area, say the stress in dealing with North Korea is on diplomacy. We don't really know. We don't know what the game plan is. We don't know what the plan B is if North Korea, keeps testing. He's also made a bunch of other actions towards China, which I think have shown great inconsistency. For his part, President Xi and Chinese officials apparently seek to mollify Trump as necessary, providing some concessions, but also looking for some of their own from Trump on investment, technology transfer, and other things. At the same time, expressing what I view as the same platitudes about win-win outcomes and the need to stress cooperative elements. China is trying to increase its leadership role in many places in the absence of American leadership in climate, in developing finance, or financing for development, and in economic integration. And this is all positive. But how that affects the United States and how you then pursue policies that can be cooperative in these areas, I think, is very rarely discussed in a serious way between the two countries. In this context of what we're looking at today, further North Korea nuclear ICBM tests, the full deployment of the THAAD system in Korea, additional Chinese buildups in the South China Sea, and a greatly worsened trade imbalance can all prompt a downward slide in the relationship and a tit-for-tat retaliation between the two countries. Without a larger strategic understanding in Asia, the US and China will continue to react episodically to problems while seeking to avoid outright conflict. They can limp along for some time like this, but the unpredictability of the security environment and of President Trump in particular make the problems much worse. I'm not unduly pessimistic, having just said that. I do think the United States and China can manage their differences, but I do think they have to look at their situation in a much more long-term and a more strategic way, and they have to adopt measures, both confidence-building and in terms of dealing with some of the conflict areas that exist in the region in a much more effective way, if we're going to avoid worsening crises and greater challenges in managing those crises. I'm sorry I spoke too long. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Michael. I think, Michael, some sort of uneasy feeling, of course, is grounded because our bilateral relations is so complicated. Then we will see the bilateral relations really got into some sort of very unexpectedly, we say, encouraging gambit. Mar-a-Lago summer meeting inject a lot of energy. But the problem is how such energy could be evenly and effectively, we say, distributed to some sort of issue-driven or we say result-based interaction process. Of course, it's a big challenge. So I really share a lot with Michael on his anxiety. So then let me invite the second panelist, Professor Carla Freeman from SAIS of Johns Hopkins University. Carla, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning. It's certainly an honor to be here. Let me begin by thanking the Institute for China-American Studies and Professor Dr. Nong Hong for inviting me to speak and join this extremely distinguished group of experts in addressing this timely topic. And thank you as well to the partner institutions for this conference. I'm going to try to make brief remarks that reflect the uncertainty about the direction of U.S.-China policy. Where does the relationship stand today? Let me begin by recalling a theme addressed by Ambassador Swaine, the point that we need to know the path we've traveled and have a sense of where we're headed. Decades of normal interactions underlie the U.S.-China relationship, and its now colossal international impact gives it something of a momentum of its own. Today, moreover, the rapport established between Presidents Xi and Trump and the absence of overt conflict make the relationship appear to be in steady state, but it's pretty clear that the US-China colossus is very unstable. It rests shakily on high expectations about very specific deliverables on one side and risky assumptions on the other. Meanwhile, all of the hot button issues that have historically strained the relationship persist: Taiwan, the South China Sea, North Korea, fair trade. However, they float today in a sea of uncertainty about the direction of US policy, not just toward China, but toward Asia writ large. As the wisdom of the ages show, uncertainty leads to miscalculation, upping the risk of confrontation when rivalry is at play. So why am I so positive about the state of US-China relations this morning? During the Obama administration, US-Asia policy certainly had its flaws. It never recovered from the incoherence about tactical emphases within the administration that went hand in hand with the rollout of the pivot, and it quickly became hijacked by its association with maritime disputes. However, the rebalance or the pivot to Asia unquestionably affirmed the durability of US identity as a Pacific actor and made it clear that the US was prepared to challenge China on its destabilizing disruptions to the status quo. The pivot policy represented continuity. History shows that the US has, since its earliest days, looked west, and its connections and commitment to Asia's well-being are intrinsic to its rise to international preeminence. 50 years ago this October, Richard Nixon wrote, "The United States is a Pacific power. The United States, with its coast reaching in an arc from Mexico to the Bering Straits, is one anchor of a vast Pacific community. Both our interests and our ideals propel us westward across the Pacific, not as conquerors, but as partners linked by the sea." The new administration's approach to Asia is one that is open-minded in the extreme about US relations toward the region. The message from the White House has been that its modus operandi is deal-making, and almost anything is negotiable. Openness to new thinking on the part of the administration represents an opportunity, but a sense that little is sacred, accompanied by a nationalistic trade agenda that belies American history in Asia, jars American alliances and damages hard-won partnerships. Within this fluid context, US-China relations have been beguilingly warm, especially for the first months of a new administration. After a phone call from President Trump reaffirming the One China policy, though we don't know exactly what was said, and then official confirmation that the three communiques remain the basis for the relationship, Xi Jinping and Trump had a very productive meeting in Mar-a-Lago, establishing a rapport that enabled the two leaders to communicate effectively. In fact, as they walked together outside, their rapport seemed so good that they appeared to be conversing without interpreters. It was successful summitry in large part thanks to President Xi's willingness to establish a personal relationship with the new American president, and it was also successful because it initiated at least a framework for future dialogues along four tracks. To date, however, unlike in the past, we've seen dialogues recalling the recent dialogues between the two sides, we've seen the two sides cover so many issues. These were expansive experiences that brought together a large spectrum of government agencies. The issues on the American side now seem to be focused narrowly on a couple of priority concerns and very high expectations on the part of the White House for outcomes. Foremost among these, of course, is the issue of North Korea, which President Trump has laid with very high expectations at China's door. Such a heavy hinging of the US-China relationship on the North Korea issue is already doing damage to the US-China relationship. President Trump has expected China to act to rein in North Korea, yet while the Chinese side has made it clear that it believes it is doing all it can. Perhaps the two sides will arrive at some new formula that will engage North Korea and provide the basis for some sort of breakthrough that will reduce the North Korea threat. But this is unlikely. Creativity in Beijing is unlikely in a climate that ahead of the 19th Party Congress and a country that is in the throes of an intense anti-corruption campaign. Those in the US with ideas about how we might move forward on the North Korea issue do not seem to have the White House's ear. Meanwhile, the recent trade talks between the world's two largest economies now both each other's largest trading partners, yielded few concrete outcomes, perhaps related to the threats of North Korea-related sanctions on Chinese entities. Concern that the US president will see betrayal in a failure by China to help deliver a breakthrough on North Korea is one present danger. But the danger of high expectations can be seen on the Chinese side as well, although in a different way. There's a troubling and growing assumption on the Chinese side that the US is in a self-determined retreat, reinforced by our loss of prestige and by hedging behavior, this time in China's direction, of countries in the region and beyond. The danger is that when we do push back against China on the South China Sea, for example, there will be a clamor for a hard response in China, and that if acted on, this risks catastrophe. But even if it is not, it will allow the death by China thesis to dominate US policy toward China. So at the moment, the relative lack of tension feels good, but it's tenuous. It shouldn't be taken for granted. What we need from the White House is a clear articulation of US policy goals in Asia that affirm the importance of constructive US-China relations as part of that. Yes, we're developing a calendar of phone-ops in the South China Sea, but we need a positive agenda that we can work on together with China. And as Dr. Swaine mentioned, there are plenty of transnational issues that could be addressed by the two sides together that would provide the sense of common purpose and sense of shared future that has been so important to the relationship during the last few decades in the absence of a simple strategic rationale of common threat. We need a comprehensive dialogue between the two sides. I just end this with a hope that we will move on that front quickly, and I'll leave it to the other panelists to continue. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Carla. I think you raised a very good question, for example. So yes, Trump administration unrealistically, it seemed to me, raised a high expectation for North Korea's issue. But so far, you also mentioned maybe some sort of, we say, lack of collaboration and coordination between the two countries probably will lead to some sort of, we say, growing appointments and some sort of, we say, even dissatisfaction. But my question is, what led to some sort of such an unrealistically, we say, heightened expectation for the DPRK issue? It's Trump administration's lack of the Chinese expertise, or it's some sort of Chinese top leader Xi Jinping's stubbornness? What's your thinking? So maybe you can respond in after all the panelists, the presentation. So our third panelist is Senior Colonel Ouyang Wei. He's a very well-known Chinese POS research fellow and working long at the POS National Defense. I can assure you, Ouyang is not just a senior professor, but he's also very open-minded, one of quite a few of the POA's high-ranking researchers who always just being very insightful to international affairs. Ouyang, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Zhu Feng. Thank you very much for the host, for everything. I first appreciate the open remarks by Mr. Wu Zhisun and also Ambassador Cui Tiankai. It's very good in the remarks on China's position on some Sino-US relations. I think it's very important. I want to quote the Ambassador Cui's opinion that China-US relation is the strategically relation. I think looking at the background of the new period, I think especially the United States, the change in the leadership, the new administration, and try to make some change. President Trump said about the new policy focus on the make America great again. So my question is how? The other things is they are more focused on the domestic issues, the changing the questions remarks to American great again from getting more material benefits or the others. And also some people said the US policy may be less concerned about ideologies. Is this true or not? I think my point of view is in generally, it's about thinking. It's about trying to make a policy. But how many days in new administration until now? I think it's a very short period. I don't think the policy is changed so much. If you change the whole policy, if you change the different in different areas, it's very difficult. Especially like Michael mentioned about the Taiwan policies, China's South China Sea. I think the leadership is changing, thinking is changing, but policy is difficult to change. And also implementation is very difficult. So look at the whole picture of the Americans. So Chinese side should be very clear watching on what's have been changed, what's not changed. Is give us a clear judgment. I think in China side, I think we don't have changed leadership. President Xi Jinping is coming from, I think you can remember the 18th Party Congress. It's the whole policy, the whole picture, the whole plan, 5-year plan, including Belt and Road Initiative, is still there. So China, compared to the United States and China not changed very much. But the United States changed more than China, I think. China also focused on domestic development. So from your side, should we understand more about China? What's changed? What's not changed? So China firmly tried to pursue the sustainable social and economic reform, and also keep the social and economic development as long as possible. Was try to make regional and international peace and stability for a long time, including Belt and Road Initiative, to try to make the win-win situation, especially the economic development for the neighbors, for the different regions, including the United States. So this is the background. So what about the Sino-US relations? We can compare some similarities. We do have some similarities and differences. United States counterparts like to use the concept of grand strategy. So China don't have used the grand strategy. But I think the entire policy, I think the China, US, United States, in this historical period, is the similarity to focus the domestic issues. President Trump's looking about to let the domestic stability and economic development, so is China. So I think the domestic issues is more important for both sides. And for the regional interests, I think both countries also try to make efforts to maintain peace and stabilities. Look the Northeast Asia, look the Middle East, also look the South China Sea. I think basically both China and the United States also like to look the stability of this region. It's benefit for everybody, including the Asian Pacific. The experts mentioned about the West Pacific. In terms of nuclear issues, both countries agree to pursue denuclearization in North Korean peninsula, concern about nuclear security. I want to mention that security and safety, the different definition. I think the safety of China is very crucial issues for nuclear safety. Look at the nuclear test area is at least just about 80 kilometers away from North Korean-China border. United States also looking for the denuclearization to protect the NPT treaty, and also and avoid potential nuclear proliferation. So the common interest is similar. One hand, China, U.S. have common interests. I think the Korean Peninsula, but in some aspects, we still have some differences. I understand the different approaches, but how to get a purpose, how to get the goals. I think the one is the terminality, maybe terminality of the peninsula, how to design the future. Is the better to the future economic development? Is better to China, Korean, and Japan integrated? I just mentioned the free trade, the relations. Is like the Northeast Asia as an engine for the future. How to deal with the potential reunification of Korean Peninsula, and how to choose the way of approach to deal with the nuclear weapons. I think these certain issues that China and the United States should be sit down and dialogue. But don't worry about it. I think the different approach is the same goal. How to integrate the meet the gaps between the two sides. I think the China and United States should be sit down and dialogue. Indeed, historical legacy is still there. Frankly, in China and both in the United States. We also think about the Cold War, think about Korean War, think about we were enemies in the 1950s. So we should not ignore the historical legacy. As for the other countries, I think the 6 parties, the 5 parties, 4 parties, etc. I think the goal is the same, but the different approaches. Some countries, I think maybe a little bit change the attitudes toward the Korean Peninsula. Now also including the new president of South Korea, President Moon. His approaches new policy. I think the people try to understand what's going on in South Korea about SAIS system, how to deal with the SAIS system, how to have a judgment of the denuclearization and the SAIS system deployed in South Korea. We do have find some common ground until anti-terrorism. Both in the United States is the main mission of the national security. Also, China is very concerned about the potential terrorists. And China inside, frankly, is with some uncertainties in the west part of China, and also in the border areas. Afghanistan, including some South Asian countries. And also cybersecurity. China and the United States also already have many dialogues, strategic dialogues, and second-track dialogues to focus on how to keep, thank you, the security of the cyber domain. I think we do have some differences. Just some friends mentioned about South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan. I think I want to mention about if the USN ships if the part of Taiwan, I think is a very negative impact on China-U.S. relations. It's let the Chinese people think about the different definition of China-U.S. relations, because the military ships porting is Taiwan is the new issues for the cross-strait relations. And also, I think above this, also some people still argue about geopolitical competition. In China and U.S. Is the model competition. What is the U.S. model? What about the Chinese model, etc.? Above this, I think there's some issues I'd like to share with the friends here. One is the Sino-U.S. relation is not zero-sum game. Differences sometimes maybe became a crisis. It depends on how to manage the potential uncertainties. Secondly, China and U.S. should be more dialogue, both strategically and operationally. Second track, 1.5 track, try hard to balance the cooperation and the competition. Thirdly, generally speaking, the nature of the policy, I think both sides, I understand, is defensive, not offensive. China and U.S. have many common ground and interests. That's why the two leaders to meet together very earlier after the election. Fourthly, from original intention, China basically is the regional country. U.S. is developed a global superpower. That's for ideology and differences, a different social system. I think whatever kind of a socialist or capitalist, which a domestic political option, it's not international framework. Nobody likes to force the others follow itself because the world is so diversity. So the two countries should respect each other. Fifthly, take more focus on crisis management. As a big country like China, US, including Russia, should play a very important responsible role in the world peace and regional stability. Sixthly, I think China-US should share the view globally, narrow the gap regionally, balance the cooperation and the competition shortly. Both countries should solve the domestic issues, flexibility on the ideology and the social system differences, and managing the potential crisis. Lastly, I think the Sino-US relation will going to stable, my judgment. Regionally, in some points, will show some uncertainties. U.S. needs time to stabilize the foreign policy and the military strategy. We need to know how to manage the differences and meet the gaps. So I'd like to share with you, my friends, recognize China and the U.S. is very important. We're not enough for both sides, such as One Belt and Road Initiative and South China Sea policies. China hopes to get U.S. support and understanding. China are waiting for the 19 parties Congress. Both China and U.S. are facing new stage, many challenges and opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Senior Colonel Ouyang. I like your thoughts about huge complexity behind China's North Korea's policy thinking and making. Our last panelist is Mr. Roy Kamphausen, the Senior Vice President of NBR. So Roy, I have a demand for you. Could you push a little bit further on how domestic political dynamic on either country now will affect our bilateral relations strategically? Thanks. Roy, please.
Okay. Maybe we'll come to that at the end. I had prepared actually in a somewhat different direction, Jufeng, but I think it'll be complementary. First, thanks to you as chair of the panel and to Dr. Nonghong for the opportunity to be here at this, on this panel with these other distinguished members and at this important day. The premise of the framing question for our panel suggests that the bilateral relationship is really contingent to a large degree on the top leaders having a shared vision for what the relationship ought to be, and suggests or implies that if the leaders get along, then that relationship will be just fine. And so great priority was given to an early meeting between the two presidents, with some risk to both, to be frank. But it strikes me that this approach, if we consider it alone, really begs the question of what the nation's broader interests are and how those interests might exist almost or pre-exist independent of the leader relations at some level. So I'll return to the role of leadership at the very end and maybe then segue to the domestic issue, Zhu. But first I wanted to highlight a dimension of the strategic relationship that we haven't talked about yet, and that is the dimension of the national security, defense, and military relationship between the two militaries. Let me start with this assertion. While the United States and China certainly have a global or strategic relationship in our diplomatic domain, as well as the economic and trade relationship, I would argue or submit for your consideration that we do not yet have a strategic relationship or a global relationship in national security affairs. Why do I say that? First, a quick review of the 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review reveals that China is viewed as a regional power, as a global economic power, in the context of what the QDR calls non-transparent military modernization efforts, and as a partner in strategic stability, which can be achieved when issues such as North Korea are properly handled. It simply does not refer to or regard China as a global military challenge. Now, this judgment may be in the process of changing. The Congress has just impaneled a new commission on national defense strategy, and certainly the commission will pay great attention to what China's military is becoming. And it's obviously the case that events such as the PLA Navy and Russian Navy exercise in the Baltics, first time, will certainly inform that thinking. But at least at this point, the QDR refers to China in a less than global sense. It's an important quote, I think, from the QDR. At the same time, we will manage the competitive aspects of the U.S.-China relationship in ways that improve regional peace and stability, consistent with international norms and principles. So it really has a regional focus to how we think of the interaction between the two militaries. So that then begs the question, how does the DoD think about China's People's Liberation Army and China's national security establishment more broadly? I think through three ways, or through 3 points of reference. First, the U.S. looks at China's modernization and China's developments through the point of reference of U.S. global roles and capabilities. As we all know, the Department of Defense has important roles throughout the globe. And in many ways, these are in service of what I would call U.S. grand strategy of maintaining U.S. global leadership in the post-Cold War era. In pursuit of these global roles and responsibilities, DoD favors force structure that is strategically offensive in order to project power to the four corners of the globe. I might differ a little bit with Professor Ouyang, who argued that China really doesn't have a grand strategy. I think for its part, although it's not articulated as such, China's grand strategy is about becoming, about attaining, about achieving the developmental goals that are associated with the two centennial anniversaries, the 2021 anniversary of the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party, and 2049, the establishment of the People's Republic of China. And to that end, China's military seeks a regional leadership role. We've certainly seen aspects in which the PLA has attained more of a global posture, but for the most part, it remains a military-seeking regional leadership. And as such, it has a strategically defensive orientation and seeks the acquisition of power that can be applied decisively when needed in certain contingencies. And so in this respect, the two really have very different approaches to their own roles and how they support the achievement of their country's grand strategies. They are not completely incompatible at this point. The second way in which DoD looks at the Chinese military or the Chinese security establishment is through the acquisition on the part of the Chinese side of what DoD calls asymmetrical capabilities. There's a broad range of these, and it can include things such as space and counterspace, cyber, which we could well return to in discussion, and also the conventional, or the acquisition of conventional means that are applied in unique and unconventional ways to demonstrate how U.S. forces might be at risk in certain contingencies in the Western Pacific. It's been coined as the anti-access area denial approach. That's the second way DoD looks at the PLA, as an asymmetrical force. The third is through a regional point of reference. And here's really where the rub lies, and several of our panels later today will look at some of the flashpoint issues. My point here is to say a couple of things. First, the United States looks at those regional flashpoint issues largely, or as a starting point, through its alliance relationships, and also the strategic partnerships that it has. Its goal, its interest is in retaining regional stability in almost all of these contexts, and we'll set aside maybe the North Korea case for a minute. I think it's of note that the 2014 agreement on Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea by the 21 nations of the Western Pacific Naval Symposium really focus on how the navies can interact and operate more safely within the context of the Western Pacific. So, in this regard, the early returns from the Trump administration, engagement with its allies, I would say are positive, especially with our important allies in Northeast Asia, Japan and North Korea, and the Republic of Korea. It can be argued that Prime Minister Abe has very effectively seized the initiative to reach out to the Trump administration, and this has yielded important developments for Japan. It's likewise a very positive development that new President Moon Jae-in would make an inaugural visit to Washington so soon after he assumed power in South Korea. The United States also has a very important partner in Taiwan, and I hope we'll return to U.S. commitment to Taiwan as an important element of the regional context as well. Now, for its part, I think the PLA regards the U.S. In a security perspective mostly through the regional context, and this is where the rub lies. The U.S. approaches the region as a global power, China approaches the region as a regional power, and the tension then results. The region is where China's security interests are, where its leadership aspirations lie, and where it sees the U.S. as impinging on the achievement of those goals and that leadership. U.S. force posture, operational patterns, and forward presence all play a role that China finds itself in opposition to. So what can be done? This is by no means an exhaustive list, but three potential pathways for consideration. The first is a path of accommodation in which the other, each yields to the other's core interests. There's almost a demarcation, if you will. And this is maybe not exactly the same as Michael has talked about, and he and I have certainly talked about his argument at some length. And we were both in Beijing last month for the World Peace Forum and had an interesting encounter there as well on this topic. The challenge, of course, of the sort of mutual accommodation, as necessary and as compelling as it might be, is that the parties are usually not urged into action until there's some sort of crisis. It's the sort of important structural change that often does not occur unless there's some sort of imperative of great peril that would force them. And that doesn't seem likely at the moment. But the need for this sort of accommodation is, I think, in many ways why we sense this notion of a Thucydides trap still has traction. At least to date, though, the two sides have found ways to bound or limit their competition. And at the very end, I'll say a word about how they do that. And indeed, in the military sphere, much of the attention of the mill-to-mill interaction between the two sides has been focused on risk reduction and conflict management and mitigation of possibility of escalation of confrontation. Well, a third pathway really would be to combine elements of the competitive approach with the accommodation approach to find ways in which a very almost certain level of competition would be measured or bounded or limited in ways that avoid that vertical escalation. It substitutes the pursuit of strategic trust with finding patterns of practical cooperation where we can on those areas where we share interests. And it recognizes that the cost of doing otherwise, of allowing competition to go unbounded, is really extraordinary and not worth contemplating. As I mentioned, let's briefly return to the subject of leader engagement. And I think this is an important area for us to recall as well. Both sides have leaders, not just the current leaders, their predecessors as well, who have acted to limit the extreme factors that threaten to pull the sides apart and threaten unbounded escalation, and that would otherwise thrust the relationship into open conflict. The leaders recognize the costs of such conflict, and they have acted to limit the possibility of it occurring. And so we think about power that is unbalanced and wonder what to do, and at least one of the answers has been the effective employment of the top leaders in directing their bureaucracies to avoid that really unbounded conflict. But they can't mitigate every source of confrontation. And so I believe we're firmly entrenched in a period in which we will have bounded competition. And the urge to manage that in effective ways will remain, and we will continue to need to find ways to do so. Now, just a word on Jufeng's point at the outset about domestic issues. My single point here would be both countries' leaders must do much more effective jobs in their public diplomacy vis-a-vis their national populations. I would argue that we both tend to inflame our populations with sometimes pretty unhealthy rhetoric, and this really does a disservice to the management of the competition that is already in place and will remain. And with that, I'm going to stop.
Thank you. Thank you, Roy, for your very comprehensive and insightful presentation. Now we almost have 20 minutes for Q&A. So then, first of all, just join me to thank Ambassador Choi for your great presentation. Thanks for coming. Yeah. I will collect a number of the questions for our panelists, then we can have a first round. Please. Okay. Yes, this. Please identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm Chen Liu from China's Xinhua News Agency, and thanks for the panel to give us a very good speech today. And I have two questions. One is for Mr. Michael Swaine. It's about that you mentioned now Trump administration still do not have a very clear and whole foreign policy towards China, and given the fact that the administration now have been quite preoccupied about the healthcare bill and about the Russian collusion investment. So probably just in the near future, the administration won't have a very clear and whole policy towards China. But under this circumstance, there are many decisions that for Trump to make the decisions, like the Taiwan's U.S. ships Taiwan protocol or the North Korea situation. So do you think that there's no clear policy towards China and there are so many decisions, quite important ones, for Trump to make? There will be a problem for the U.S.-China relations in the near future. And the second one is for the last speaker, Mr. Kamphausen. You've just mentioned about the China's alliances in Asia, like Japan and South Korea. And nowadays, we see a very close relationship between Japan and the European countries, like the free trade deal with the EU and they're talking about the defense deal with Germany. So do you think that will affect U.S. role as the leading power in the world? Thank you.
Okay, so the second question will be the gentleman just behind you, please, sir. Yeah, behind that. No. The gentleman just before the girl, just who mentioned the question. So, yeah, please.
Thank you very much. My name's Arnold Zeitlin. I've been teaching.
Could you stand up and identify yourself? Thanks a lot. Yeah. A little bit, speak a little bit loud. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, fine.
It worked.
This is for Dr. Swaine. You mentioned a buffer in the Pacific, and I wonder if you could expand on those remarks.
Okay, good question. Richard.
Michael, I want to push you a little bit on balance of power and a new balance of power. Part of the U.S. part of the balance has been our allies, allies and partners. To some extent, the problems that we have to manage with China are associated with those allies. So how do they factor into this sort of re-gearing of the balance of power?
Mm-hmm. Good question. So, yeah, over there. The young gentleman. And the Yan Yan will be last one in this round. Then we'll be back to the panelists. Please.
Hi, my name is Eric Chang, and I'm an intern at the Department of State. So this question is mainly directed at Dr. Kamphausen, but it's open to any of the other panelists as well. So in recent years, we've seen a large restructuring of the PLA that largely coincides with the recent 13th five-year plan, in which Xi Jinping has consolidated a lot of the decision-making power and lessened a lot of the autonomy of the different branches of the PLA in order to focus such power onto himself in more of like a vertical fashion. So I'm just curious how this affects military-to-military relations in the future between the U.S. and China. Does such an restructuring change the ways that the U.S., change the methods that the U.S. should employ in order to communicate with the PLA? For example, does that mean a lessening of sort of like horizontal interaction and more of an intensification of communication solely between the heads of state? Thank you.
Thank you, Yan Yan. Yeah.
Hi, this is Yan Yan of China National Institute for the South China Sea Studies. I have one question to both Professor Ouyang and to Mr. Kamphausen. My question is, how do you evaluate the current bilateral military-to-military mechanism like DMMCA on managing future and possible crisis? And among all security issues like Taiwan, South China Sea, and North Korea, which one do you think is the most dangerous and could probably lead to a future conflict between the two? Thank you.
Okay, good question. So then we just end about first round. So then let me invite our panelists. Mike, you first.
Okay. Well, I think there were three questions that were addressed to me. One of them basically was, if the U.S. doesn't really have a clear enough policy toward China, are we headed for increased problems? As I said in my remarks, I certainly think that the lack of consistency and the lack of clarity presents challenges because of the contingent nature of certain issues involved in the relationship. Right now, the most important one is North Korea. And successfully handling that issue is really going to be a big factor in influencing the overall US-China relationship, it seems. The other one is trade and the trade imbalance. Now, both of these are subject to assessments on both the US and the Chinese side, but particularly on the US side, which I think are just extremely unclear. I mean, we don't have a clear sense about what the Trump administration's ultimate game plan is about the North Korea situation under certain types of contingencies. And so it's possible that the administration could become far more confrontational in dealing with China on this issue if there's no sign that the North Korean government is restrained itself in what it's doing. And so I think the lack of enough dialogue between the US and China on dealing with contingencies and on dealing with the long-term future of the Korean Peninsula, which is part of China's fear in assessing what it should do toward the peninsula. The lack of that kind of real dialogue, I think, does leave the situation much more unpredictable. I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know what Trump's reaction will be, and whether or not his reaction will be sufficiently contained, if it is indeed a provocative one, by Mattis and Tillerson and others. We just don't know. I mean, the most unpredictable factor in the US-China relationship right now is the United States and US policy and US leadership. Now, having said all that, I think that the relationship is relatively bounded right now and restrained in what each side is going to do, absent some major, as I said, major provocation going on, say, in North Korea, by two factors. One of them is the 19th Party Congress, focusing China very much on maintaining a placid external environment, not having confrontations. And the other one is the relative stability in the economic situation right now between the US and China, despite a lot of grievances in different areas. But as I say, these things could change. I would think the more concerning period for me would be next year and the year after that, then the remainder of this year. Again, absent some kind of really major event on the Korean Peninsula. The second, what does the buffer mean? Well, I would ask that people read a report that I've written about this to get the details on this, and I'd say the same to Richard, I guess. I'm sort of struck by how people in Washington, to some extent, we don't read each other. It's amazing to me, and I understand why it exists. We're all busy, we're all running around, but we sort of don't do it. And it just, it undermines, I think, our ability to communicate to each other. The buffer concept is really one that seeks to establish a set of understandings over time in which neither country has the capability to project power along the maritime periphery in ways that would really threaten the core interests of the other. Now, that's a very complicated thing to define and to achieve. And I try to do that in this study. And it's not something that I could exactly sum up in a sentence, but it involves transitioning to a force posture that is more what's called denial-oriented in terms of military force structure and doctrine, as opposed to war-winning and offensive-oriented. And I think the two countries still have much of the latter and very little of the former. And I think it requires also a set of understandings, deeper understandings involving demilitarization of the Taiwan Straits issue, the South China Sea issue, and the Korea issue. But I just ask you to read that report, and then you can sort of attack me again based on that. The third would be specifically Richard's question about balance of power. Again, I try to deal with this. I actually think that a stable balance in Asia requires a selective strengthening of the US-Japan alliance, not throwing the Japanese over the transom, not undermining their, it requires a certain strengthening of that position. In part because I think it requires also the establishment of a Korean peninsula that is not as closely aligned to the United States today as it is today. It's going to require a unified Korean peninsula that is only, to some extent, I don't want to say nominally, but is limited in its alliance commitments between the United States and a unified Korea, with virtually no U.S. forces of any kind on the peninsula. To make that work, you have to have a relationship with Japan. Well, the Koreans, of course, have to accept it, but you have to also have a relationship with the Japanese, I think, that is much more reassuring. And that requires a stronger relationship with Japan. I think under the larger context of a balance, that kind of situation could be acceptable to the Chinese, given the other kinds of definition, the other kinds of features of that environment that I described in that study. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay. Carla, do you have anything to say?
Go to the next set of questions, and maybe we'll have time for another round.
Ouyang?
Yes. Thank you for your question. I think China and the United States should be a strategic partner in deal with different issues, especially in regional flashpoint. You just mentioned about the Taiwan issues and the South China Sea issues. I think for Chinese point of view, sometimes the United States use the Taiwan as the instruments to give China's pressure. Something like the arms sales, not very much, but if you sell the offensive weapon system to Taiwan, it makes Chinese mainland make some negative attitude. Depends on what kind of weapon system you can sell. The other issues I just mentioned about the warships to maybe Pentagon try to porting the warship in Taiwan, Kaohsiung, something well. Maybe some refuel in the Taiping Islands. Someone said. I think the new issues for China. I'm not sure the U.S. government and the DoD is thinking as potentially behind the scene is what the policy shift toward the mainland China. And also, I want to support China, United States side. The President Trump is also insist the strongly support the one China policy. It's not a tentative. It's a long policy, principle to deal with the cross-strait relations. This is very important. The making two bilateral relations very stable. The other side is in terms of South China Sea issues. For Chinese side, is the territory issues. So, including domestic issues, we Chinese, for my point of view, is the priority is national unity and territory integrity. Compare China with United States. United States has no border issues, no uncertainty territory issues. But China, look around China, we do have two states have no side border agreements with China, India, and Bhutan. And also have border issues and uncertainties around China. What about 14 neighboring countries? Very complicated situation around China regionally. So China have a lot of problems. South China Sea issues basically is a territory issues. China is look at China is the islands and reefs to have some construction and deploy some military equipment to protect them. It's reasonable. So it's not in terms of, in fact, the U.S. policy called freedom of navigation. But we can sit down and dialogue. What's your point? What's China's point? What's the United States' point? And, so I think the people argue that if the United States is looking China to have a potential geopolitical confrontation in the West Pacific, China don't think so. So if United States not respect the territory of China, maybe some problem. So my suggestion is we should be dialogue, and like the U.S. Navy and China side consultation agreements with the avoid the air and sea accidents is good for the two militaries, avoid potential conflicts in South China Sea. Thank you.
There are three questions addressed to me. The first, I think really, while the example was, does the agreement recently of Japan, EU, and an FTA, how does that affect U.S. leadership? I think this is really a question about, does U.S. withdrawal from TPP, even if there's virtually no chance it would have passed this year and probably not next year either, but does the very active withdrawal negatively impact U.S. leadership? And that hardly seems debatable, doesn't it? And so Japan, while a very strong and confident partner of the United States, as I mentioned, Prime Minister Abe took proactive steps to, at a very early point, to establish a productive working relationship with President Trump, even President-elect Trump. That doesn't mean Japan's going to take all its cues from the United States, and in fact, it is to a certain degree with the EU filling a void on the trade front. The second question was about PLA restructuring, and does the restructuring make Xi Jinping as chairman of the Central Military Commission a more powerful leader with more centralized controls, and does that somehow affect U.S.-China military engagement as a result? I'm not sure. First, the restructuring is primarily about making the PLA a more modern force, prepared to respond to contingencies on its periphery. So transitioning from an inwardly focused 7 military region structure to a structure that is prepared to look externally in 5 theaters of operation. I'm not sure that fundamentally changes interactions with the U.S., except to say it may facilitate them because the two militaries will think more alike and will be prepared to view the world in more similar ways than they had previously. The third question was, how do we evaluate mill-to-mill? I'm pretty sanguine. Since 2014, U.S. and China have put in place several agreements to manage the likelihood of incidental conflict, to do risk reduction, to build confidence. The disaster management exchange mechanism is a very interactive process led by the two armies that responds to real-world humanitarian assistance, disaster relief contingencies, and then builds an iterative exercise process to be able to respond to those. So in that respect, it's as healthy as it's been in more than 20 years. But there's really a limited upside to how much mill-to-mill will gain you. We're not going to operate together in any meaningful way. Disaster relief is one context, but beyond that, there are really limitations to how much we can do. And so we ought not regard that mill-to-mill relationship as productive as it might be as a panacea for everything that the two militaries face in terms of challenges. The last question was, which issue is the most likely result in, is the most dangerous likely result in conflict? We're going to consider all those issues in the next 2 panels, so maybe we'll just leave it to them to sort out.
Okay, Carla, you have anything to say?
I thought I'd just quickly take your question to me about why President Trump may have come in with this this high priority on resolving North Korea through pressuring China through working with Xi Jinping to do that. And I think that the issue itself, the approach itself, represents a measure of continuity with the Obama administration. And I think President Trump we used to talk about the CNN effect. He definitely has the cable news effect. I think that Fox News and CNN really suggested that if President Obama could have persuaded Xi to do more, that then the issue could be solved. And I think President Trump prides himself on his ability to persuade, to push, to pressure, and one of his sayings is the worst of times creates the best opportunities to make good deals. I think coming in, he has a sense that this crisis is a good time to make a deal. And my concern, the point that I was trying to make, is just that the emphasis on this particular issue in the U.S.-China relationship is very dangerous at the moment.
Great. I think the time is almost running out, so we have no time space for the second round. I'm just trying to do a very brief conclusion. I think, first of all, four panelists that truly provided us a very illuminatory, comments and their analysis. So personally, I enjoy a lot. But secondly, I see strategic dimension of our relations now. To my understanding, on one hand, is more declaratory. By using this word declaratory, I mean actually a lot of things make more sense to both sides. We understand where the huge stake is and how we should just, move and trade softly. But the problem is, given some sort of very contentious political background on either side, then literally and even in policy, it's a little bit hard to just move that way. So it's some sort of a new gap. For example, so then I think North Korea's issue truly is a new driver for both sides to address the mutually shared challenges. But if we get back to concrete policy context on either, then we will see there's a lot of opposition, hesitation, and even, we say, suspicion for some sort of getting closer between both sides. Then second is our strategic dimension of bilateral relations is really, really unpredictable. For example, so we heard a lot of words out of this government. It's a transactional. But I think it's really misplaced if we put the North Korea's issue into very exactly transactional framework. Because as Michael and other panelists have said, North Korea's issue is really more strategic than just some sort of a very concrete deal driven to some sort of business. So both leaders should have some sort of such a overall picture examination, rather than just tactically just push aside, push on your counterparts, and just trying to winning some sort of very tentative game. Otherwise, then we'll see some sort of disappointment and frustration also while surging, and even put our relations on some sort of growing vulnerability. So then I can't tell you how much I like today's first session's discussion. So finally, please join me to thank four panelists. Now it's a coffee break.
This concludes our first panel. So we're going to take a 15-minute coffee break. So please stand up, stretch your legs, have some coffee, and be prepared to reconvene in 15 minutes.